I'll bet you didn't realize you could start a staffing agency with fish head soup, but I remember my first really good month in recruiting. It was a big high, and then it was immediately followed by a very big low. So let me tell you about the high and the low and how I started a staffing and recruiting agency with fish head soup and how you can do it too. So the high was everything you would expect. Big numbers, jealous coworkers, serendipity, seemingly effortless placements coming in. My name atop the sales leaderboard for all to see. The promissory spreadsheet of commission earned, congratulatory remarks, and precisely 2 half-hearted, concerted hand claps at our daily huckster meeting. But then the low came on the first day of the very next month. I was a well-minted closer by this time, on my way to indulge in my entitlement of company coffee in the break room. And this is where I happened to run into the big boss, like the owner of the firm I worked at. This fairly mundane encounter is where everything changed for me. So naturally, I figured he would still be basking, as I was, in the afterglow of my incredible month. He was probably quietly reminiscing about all of the bundles of money I had made for him. That's what I thought, especially given how quickly I had produced at such a high level. Boy, he must be so excited about that. "Hi, Ryan," he said unenthusiastically, then looking at me directly in the eyes with his not messing around face, he said, "Where's your next placement coming from?" I stumbled to find words in like a bit of shock. Wait, what? Was he confusing me with like another one of his recruiting minions? Surely we were past that question by now, or at least until like later in the month. Did he not remember yesterday's leaderboard? Was his memory erased at the same time as that big whiteboard? Did he forget that I was this like rookie prodigy with no clients and no repeat business? All of my sales for the month had solely come from recruiter side billings. Was he no longer appreciative of the effort I had been putting in for months to get to these numbers? Well, the bottom line is that nothing from last month mattered. It was a new month. Forget everything you did last month. That was like the mentality. Just time to suck it up and do it all again. This marked the beginning of the end of my employee mindset. I was discovering that I needed more than just a leaderboard and 2 claps. I was not motivated enough to repeatedly and tirelessly work the same old fishing holes day after day. And that's when I began dreaming about starting a staffing and recruiting agency. The plight of an underling desk jockey like myself at the time was that of perpetual survival fishing. I had one single fishing rod to use in fairly unknown waters and with other fishers whose music tastes I wasn't partial to. And this one pathetic rod was all I had for reeling in fish. In other words, candidates all the way to the boat or to placement. So like any recruiter, sometimes I'd get the fish all the way to the net only to have them somehow escape. Like they'd fall off, accept a counteroffer, they'd flake out. And once in a while, I'd have to throw one back. They'd get fired. But here was the big kick in the pants. Every time I brought a fish all the way to the boat, I had to hand it over to my boss. It was his boat. I was just part of the crew. Once I got a fish to the boat, it became his fish. He paid me for catching a fish by chopping off the head. I'd get the fish head and he'd get the rest. And sure, there's a bit of meat in a fish head. You can apparently make a soup from, which you and your family can try to subsist. But each time I sat there with my pot of fish head soup, I couldn't help thinking about how great it would be if I could keep the whole fish. Why couldn't I? I caught the darn thing. Why couldn't I keep it? Well, there were indeed a couple reasons why I couldn't keep the whole fish at the time, but I saw no good reason for why that couldn't change in the not so distant future. After all, I could use the same old fishing rod from shore or from my own tiny boat. And once I was convinced of this, the only question left was when that future would happen. On what day, I wondered, should I start endeavoring to keep the entire fishmonger bounty? In other words, by starting a staffing agency. By the way, I want to interrupt this story for just a second to tell you about something important. If you want some free resources that are going to kickstart your agency and get you on the growth hack fast track. Check out the SFS Client Capture Conversion and Control Kit. It includes 30 days to leads, loyalty, and leverage. It includes cold email lead machine. It includes recruiting and staffing agreement templates. It includes how to use AI to run your staffing and recruiting agency, which is a whole course, and you can grab them all for free at sevenfigurestaffing.com/CCCC. That's 4 C's. Go grab that. And now we'll get back to the story. Let's talk about timing considerations for starting a staffing agency. When we think of this question about when the best time is for starting your own staffing and recruiting agency, we must be thinking of time in terms of at least 2 separate categories. So time consideration number 1 is a macro scale decision. In other words, the best time for making such a change in the course of your life or your career. And time consideration number 2 is a micro scale decision. In other words, the best season or point in the business cycle where starting up may be most favorable. So let's consider both categories right here. Time consideration number 1. When would be the best time in my life and career to start a staffing agency? While I didn't know this answer at the time of starting a staffing and recruiting agency, I now know that the time was now. Or I guess then. Or in other words, well before it actually happened. I was always a good biller. In other words, I knew how to catch fish. But then again, I didn't have much experience with fishmongers, in other words, clients. However, in hindsight, my experience with clients never came until I went out on my own. So there was really no skill gap that needed to be filled before making this rite of passage. So the only cause for delay was essentially a static inclination. And that's just a fancy way of saying that I only felt like dipping toes in the water. And of course, there's never a great reason for a swimmer to avoid jumping in the lake. The most rational course is to just go for it and jump in. Therefore, the only reason one could possibly delay the act of swimming when they have already committed to the endeavor is a combination of resistance and lack of will. In short, laziness. I was too lazy to start a staffing and recruiting agency, and I had apparently become too comfortable with fish head soup. So I wondered, which motivation would win? Would my desire to stop slavishly handing over hard-earned pristine fish fillet to my recruiting master prevail, or would my temptation to succumb to resistance and lazy inclination win the day? And by the day, I mean my life. Well, it took a while for this drama to play out. Every day, week, and month of hesitation was another day of subjecting my family to subsistence fish head soup. It was another day of deferring our future. It was another day of delaying investment in myself. And frankly, I look back on my hesitation to take action as irresponsibility because I owe more to my family than fish heads. And each day I waited was a sacrifice of future potential and opportunity to my selfish sluggishness. Once the fish heads would get boiled, there was really not much left over. But if I could somehow get my hands on a whole fish, heck, I could use the fish head to pay someone else to do the work that I preferred not to do. And my present situation had been living proof of that possibility. And then I could pretty much live like a king off even just like one of the fillets of each fish that I caught. Then I'd still have the other fillet that I could smoke or freeze and bank for the future. And little did I know, I'd soon have more fillets than I knew what to do with. The best time in your life and career to start a staffing and recruiting agency is now. There's no good reason to wait. However, let me point out a bit of a caveat to that statement. I'm not suggesting that you just call up your boss and just tell him to shove his fish heads. You still might need those for a while. Don't just dive overboard and try to swim to shore after leaving your fish guts on the captain's deck. You must harness the fish head. Let it help you to start a staffing and recruiting agency. Make the fish head a key player in your bootstrap engine. Let it be a primary source of your motivation every day. Use the fish head to start a staffing and recruiting agency. Ryan, what does that even mean? It means everything. It means the exact opposite of what you would probably want to do. I'm going to explain what I'm talking about here. I'm not about to make a jab at you. This is a jab at myself, if anything. I'm about to make a general comment on human nature. We all want to start big. We have many ideas and visions that we can visualize becoming real big one day. And I know this because I hear about these ideas, and I've had a few retrospectively funny ideas myself. I'll go first. So let me tell you about a doozy. Not even a year after starting a staffing agency, I already thought I was ready for more new ventures. It's outrageous, okay? This is the kind of ridiculous ego trip that can happen when you start tasting success. So get this, while thinking that I had already made the big time from starting a staffing agency, I decided to try my hand at starting up a new charity as well. I thought I was somehow going to establish a nonprofit charity sports league in a nearby city. Well, guess how that turned out? It was a total mental failure. It was a complete waste of time and nothing more than a distraction. It was the exact wrong thing to do at that particular stage of starting a staffing and recruiting agency. I could go on, but I'll save you the messy details of my many other blunders for another day. The fact is, I'm not the only one who suffers from onsets of compulsive distraction disorder, or CDD, when starting a staffing agency. And that may or may not be a legitimate medical disorder. I have no idea, but I do know that it is a very real and very widespread staffing and recruiting entrepreneurial disorder. And I've encountered many an entrepreneur just innocently attempting to start a staffing agency, coming into a deficit of one particular attribute, and that attribute is called focus. The dreaded F word. Let me show you more very real examples that demonstrate the lack of focus that can very often turn up when starting a staffing and recruiting agency. One gentleman told me he couldn't yet start a staffing agency until he consumed an extremely long list of courses and books, loosely based around the subject. Another said he couldn't start a staffing agency until he had client testimonials. Hint, you need clients first to get those. One lady said that starting a staffing agency was progressing slowly because she was trying to incorporate event management into the business. Now, I'm sure you've already guessed it, but here is the bottom line and common denominator of all these entrepreneurs. They were not focused on starting a staffing agency. If you want to start a staffing agency, then starting a staffing agency should be your focus. Your focus should not at all be copious books and courses or client testimonials or event management. These all might be fine ideas when you get past the startup phase and into expansion mode. But for right now, please take this one piece of advice. Just focus on starting a staffing agency. You can start a staffing and recruiting agency right now with fish heads. And we're still talking about how to do that. Remember, there are 3 ways to start a staffing agency with fish heads. Way number 1 is with thrift. You have no choice. You're living off of fish heads, and you can't give up your fish head gig just yet. Not until you catch at least a couple of your own fish in your little boat. That is, in your new staffing agency. So don't go buying big fancy calculators for your new office just yet. And don't go on thinking you need things like funding. That's just another focus problem. It's a distraction. It's a mistake. So forget the funding and just focus on your simple formula for starting a staffing agency. Here's the formula. Brain plus vocal cord plus motivation plus fish heads equals starting a staffing agency. It's really as simple as that. So now let's talk about how to put it all to work for you with fish heads. Number 2, pre-selling. So one more note about number 1. Don't be thrifty just with money. Be thrifty with your time also. Don't spend time or money on candidate acquisition in the early stages of starting a staffing agency. Proactively pre-sell your candidates. In other words, don't start by catching fish. No, start by marketing the fish you know you can catch. Every fishmonger has a favorite fish. Find out what sort of fish the fishmongers in your area like to monger. That's the first step in starting a staffing agency. Sell the idea of your fish. Show the fishmonger the fish's profile. Maybe give them a brochure. Let them choose the profile of the fish they most prefer. This is a very crucial step in knowing what sort of fish you ought to be fishing for with your staffing agency. Obviously, the development of your fishing strategy is completely dependent on this step. Number 3, niche validation. Now try selling your hypothetical fish profiles at various fish markets. Which ones like your fish? Some may want to pre-order your fish. If that's the case, you may want to start a staffing agency that exclusively services that particular market. Notice that we have completed all the first steps of starting a staffing agency almost entirely with fish heads. We didn't need anything else outside of our bodies and brains beyond the fish heads. Again, the fish heads nourished us and kept us strong and enabled our brain and vocal cords to pre-sell profiles of our fish. Meanwhile, the fish head soup is our constant reminder to stay focused on starting a staffing agency. Thus, the fish heads provide the motivation as well. Now we're going to move on to time consideration number 2. When would be the best seasonal period or point in the business cycle to start a staffing agency? As long as you stick to the minimalist formula being prescribed here, it's not particularly risky to start at any point. Seasonal business cycles will depend largely on your niche. Each industry, of course, is going to have somewhat different hot and cold seasons. I happen to start a staffing agency in the off season, and I'm glad I did. Of course, when I started, I did not know it was the off season, but the response from marketing hypothetical fish quickly informed me of such. So here are 4 benefits I found to starting a staffing agency in the off season. Benefit number 1, I found that I was able to locate and tag fish in the off season that normally could not be caught in the high season. And I was able to basically categorize and stockpile a database full of tagged fish to access once the fishmongers were ready for them in the busy season. Benefit number 2, I was able to get on the radar of prospects and start a marketing campaign in their off season. And by the time they needed me, I was top of mind, familiar, and in many cases, their first call for staffing requirements. Benefit number 3, when the fishmongers aren't that hungry for most fish, you get a really precise idea of their utmost favorite fish. Some fish they'll buy all year round or in any economy. And once you know what fish they really love all the time, this tells you precisely what to specialize in fishing for. Benefit number 4, companies will often review their vendors in their off season. They sometimes make a decision at year end or in the first quarter on whether or not they will seek new vendors for various functions. They'll often be seeking new fishers before their fishing season really gets going. Now, starting a staffing agency in the busy season also has advantages. Namely, you get much better traction much more quickly, and your business has the potential to grow very fast. So yeah, try to be ready for that rapid growth, but unless you have experience working the niche you plan to start a staffing agency in, chances are you won't know the precise cycles of your target market just yet. And unless you've already begun the steps we've discussed, you will often have limited familiarity about when your target market generally heats up. And guess what? You have to get that information by starting a staffing and recruiting agency. So, no matter what, it seems, the best time to start a staffing and recruiting agency with fish head soup is right now. And if you want to get started quickly, I suggest you head on over to sevenfigurestaffing.com. Check out our resources, watch these other videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.